All of us are certainly familiar with batteries and powering things because our lives now totally revolve around that electricity stream, but there is a high cost for how this cobalt that is a major ingredient in these batteries is being mined. We are very, very honored as we continue the show to be joined by Siddharth Kara, who's the author of Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives. I've been reading the book. I really recommend folks pick it up. And Mr. Kara, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we're really happy to have you, and we wanted to pull up here. You know, you've been putting out some truly harrowing videos across your social media feed. It's, you were on Joe Rogan and others, and this one I think has caught a lot of people's eyes here of pit mining. And I was hoping you could just start by explaining, what is going on in this photo here, and what are the consequences for the people who are working there?
Well, it caught my eyes when I climbed the ridge, and then this pit just revealed itself, crammed full of a sea of humanity, men and boys clanking and hammering against a giant mountain of cobalt-bearing rock to break it off from mountain to boulder, then boulder to pebble, and then fill it in the sacks. You can see the train of people in the back climbing out of the pit with sacks on their shoulders. This is the bottom of the cobalt supply chain. Cobalt, as your viewers probably know, is used in the manufacture of almost every lithium-ion rechargeable battery used in the world today. So smartphones, tablets, laptops, and crucially, electric vehicles. And that's what the bottom of the supply chain looks like.
Mm.
We hear a lot from certain companies and also certain, NGOs about the idea of there being a clean way to have cobalt, to have these batteries. It's the idea that somehow the supply chain is clean. We've investigated it. Nobody was abused in the process of getting this mineral. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about if that's actually legitimate or not? Is there actually a clean way as of now in the supply chains to get this stuff?
Look, I've spent months on the ground in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which supplied almost 3/4 of the global supply of cobalt last year. And I can tell you there's no such thing, based on what I've seen, there's no such thing as clean cobalt. The cobalt that is mined in the Congo is tainted by an array of hazardous and abusive conditions, from child labor to forced labor, to environmental destruction, to public health catastrophes. It's an absolute horror show. And proclamations of clean cobalt are nothing more than marketing and puffery, based on what I've seen in the Congo, meant to just allay people's concerns and continue business as usual. And the fact of the matter is, it puts a barrier in front of actually addressing the human rights and environmental violence taking place in one of the poorest and most downtrodden patches of Earth on this planet.
One of the things that I guess I have always thought of when I think of these minerals is that, and you detail very well in the book, is that they're toxic, that they're very toxic. And when I think of mining, I'm always thinking of, runoff. I'm from the state of Virginia, where that's, been a long time problem going back hundreds of years. So one of the things I think I'm curious about, and others are, is, what's the health impact, especially to have so many, kids and others working in these mines? What's the health impact of doing this day in and day out?
This is one of the completely underreported calamities about this entire value chain of stone to phone and car. Cobalt is toxic to touch. It is toxic to breathe. There are hundreds of thousands of women and girls, men and boys, young women with babies strapped to their backs who are touching and inhaling cobalt day in and day out. It has an array of health consequences, from cancers to birth defects to respiratory ailments to acute dermatitis. The list goes on and on and on. And that's just touching cobalt. Cobalt is often bound in nature to other very hazardous things, chief among them radioactive uranium. So there's been no accounting for the public health, this extreme public health impact on this population of people living in the cobalt mining provinces of the DRC.
And then there's this other element here, which is the idea that, oh, we need cobalt to save the climate, right? Because the only way to get off of fossil fuels is to like move to electric vehicles and to things that are, made to work by these lithium batteries. And so I'm curious, like, how do you respond to that? Because I mean, it also speaks to an issue of, okay, so like if we're going to deal with climate change, should the conversation really be about mining for cobalt to the point that we're like destroying a country and the people there and also stealing a resource? And we can talk more about that too. Or should we be having conversations more about like maybe instead of electric cars, we should have public transportation systems that make it so we don't need electric cars? But anyways, I'm curious if you can speak to sort of that element of like environmentalism that is among a certain segment of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, climate sustainability targets are important, right? We need to preserve this planet that we all inhabit. However, we cannot and should not pursue a green energy transition at the expense of immense violence against the people and environment of Central Africa. It can't be green for us and red and black and horrible for them. That's hypocrisy. It's outside of any concept of basic decency, dignity, and moral boundary, that our green future cannot be at the expense of the destruction of Central Africa. And I think that is a missing part of this conversation. So you're quite right. Do we need to talk more about public transportation or, frankly, ethical mining, decent mining? I mean, if a mining company were to set up operations in our backyards, they'd be subjected to any number of regulations around sustainability and so on. And mining, no matter what, involves gouging and the earth and clear cutting trees. But you know what? They probably would plant those trees back in our part of the world. But in the Congo, millions of trees have been clear cut. I never spoke to anyone who said they saw one tree being planted to replace them. Mining companies dump toxic effluents in the air, dirt, and water, polluting the environment. So even if you live there and have nothing to do with mining, you're still being contaminated by mining activity every day. And that's the part of the story that we need to talk more about and that I hope comes out and emerges in my book, Cobalt Red.
Mm-hmm. No, well, I think it does. And again, I hope people do pick up Cobalt Red. I mean, it's a harrowing read, but I think it's an important read. And, one of the things I'm also curious about is what's the situation for folks there on the ground in the DRC who are trying to find a way to push back or do research or something like that to raise awareness about what's going on in their country?
Yeah, it's very perilous for people who live there. Civil society is very, very thin. There are secrets that must be protected in the mining sector because of the amount of money at stake. And, it is very difficult for outsiders to get into the mining provinces, to go around and document what's happening, talk to people. And of course, if you live there and you're seen to be trying to reveal the truth, there can be very dire consequences. I mean, the most dire consequences for people living there. The mining provinces are secured by the army, by mining police, by roving militias, by Republican Guard, and they're all there to secure minerals and ensure the flow of these valuable minerals out of the ground, up the chain to companies that are worth trillions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about the fact that there's all this exploitation taking place of people in this country, the workers, the land, is the country itself able to even reap any benefits at all, like using profits from this mineral to develop, to fund education, to fund basic infrastructure? And I can guess the answer to that question, but please.
Sure. This is one of the great tragedies of the Congo. Which is that it is blessed with enormous resources that go back generations. From timber to ivory to rubber to gold to diamonds to nickel, manganese, and of course cobalt. But the value has been pillaged and ransacked by foreign powers going back centuries, siphoned out of the ground, out of the country, often by using the local population as a slave labor force. And so the people of the Congo have really never benefited in any meaningful way from the immense resource riches their country is blessed with. Part of that is just the pillaging and piracy of the colonial period. But then after that, corruption and poor governance continued that theme of whatever's valuable in the Congo is ripped out of the ground, makes maybe a short stop at the bank accounts of the government, and then heads right upstream to the real power brokers at the top of the chain.
Yeah, that's one of the things reading the book. I mean, so many things that have come to me. I mean, one, I was perusing it yesterday, and someone texts me, and I pick up my phone and I start scrolling, and I see, the estimations on Twitter from the government, about how much money they're going to make from mining, and that in and of itself was amazing cognitive dissonance. But the thing I kept coming back to is I don't know, you're just always looking for who can I point the finger at? And it just felt like everyone's hands were dirty here. And you can't point the finger in just one direction. The mining companies, the government, the Apples of the world, the car companies, everyone is in a way complicit. And I say that just to say, writing this book, how much of what you wanted to do was really alert the consumer to what was happening? Because it seems in a weird way, we actually have a lot of power here based on what we are willing to consume and under what, rules and circumstances.
Yeah, you make several very important points. And the first one is, everybody up the chain, standing on the shoulders of the child in the toxic pit in the Congo. Everybody is siphoning value off that kid's work, off the peasant population's hard labor. They're all siphoning value and enjoying value. And of course, the lion's share of that value is at the top of the chain, the consumer-facing tech and EV companies. And that's one of the great tragedies that I wanted the reader and the world to understand. I think the consumer has a very important role to play, and it's not up to the consumer to solve this problem. Obviously, I mean, we've been made unwitting participants in this tragedy, in this injustice, in this invasion of the human rights of the people of the Congo. I mean, none of us want to walk around with a blood-caked battery in our pocket. None of us want to type on a blood-caked laptop. And none of us want to think we're making a green choice to preserve the planet when we buy an EV at the expense of immense destruction and violence in the heart of Africa. So the role of the consumer, we can't solve the problems on the ground, but we can sound the bell. We can sound the alarm. And that means flooding the world with this truth, demanding more be done to address these injustices, and not tolerating this kind of violence against some of the poorest people in the world well into the 21st century.
Well, I also want to ask you this follow-up, too, because, and you already mentioned this, but one of the things I really appreciate about the book is you keep coming back to history and you keep showing people and reminding them of the history of the Congo. And, obviously this has been a huge issue in the past year with the issue of the return of the tooth by Lumumba and how, minor that was. But, I mean, how much of the conversation here should feed back into the conversation around reparations for colonialism? Because it does feel, I mean, even if, the Congolese government was able to use the royalties to the best possible ability, that there's still this legacy that should also be contributing to the healthcare, the clean water, the education, and so on.
It's impossible to even begin to calculate the amount of harm that's been done on Africa as a continent and the heart of Africa, that Congo region, for centuries. I mean, there's just no quantum for it. I mean, centuries of slave trade, of foreign pillage, of colonialism have left that part of the world so poor, so grindingly poor, and never really breaking free from the yoke of those colonial and then neo-colonial interests. And I think that needs to be a part of the conversation. You mentioned Lumumba. I mean, he was, for those who don't know, the first democratically elected president of the country at independence in 1960. He had a bold nationalist, anti-colonial vision. He wanted the country's mineral resources, which were responsible for about 70 or 80% of the economy at independence. He wanted those resource riches to be for the benefit of the people. Just as we were talking about a moment ago, let our people of Congo, enjoy the benefit of the value and of their own resources with schools and public health and infrastructure and education and so on. And in short order, within months, he was conspired against, assassinated, chopped to pieces, dissolved in acid, bones ground to dust, save that one tooth you mentioned that was taken as a trophy by one of the Belgian assassins, and then only returned decades later, last year. So yeah, there needs to be a conversation about reparations. On the one hand, I mean, what would that number even look like? But there's something that needs to be done. And conversely, the ongoing pillage of these people and their resources is certainly not the right trend.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think even if you think you know that it's bad and you think you've heard about it, you have to read Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives, because I thought I knew how bad it was, and to be honest, it was worse than I thought. But I think it's an important conversation we have to start having, and I really appreciate you doing this work, taking the risks, and bringing it out here to the world, and joining us here in the Freedom Side. Siddharth Kara, thank you so much for being with us here.
Thank you so much for having me.